And joining us now on the debate, Michael Bell, former Canadian diplomat, and Paul Martin, Senior Chair on International Diplomacy at the University of Windsor. And Akaash Maharaj, President of the new Liberalism Foundation. And we're pleased to welcome back once again Edward Greenspon, Chair of the Global Positioning Strategy Project. And a reminder to everybody watching, this is a Your Agenda Thursday broadcast, so you can reach us via Twitter at twitter.com/theagenda or by email at theagenda@tvo.org. And our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is hosting a live chat on our Inside Agenda blog. That's on the homepage, tvo.org/theagenda. So please jump in, join the debate. Lots of ways for you to participate in tonight's broadcast. Okay, Akaash, Michael, nice to have you back here in studio. Let's start. I want to read another quote from Edward's document there, and it goes like this. It is up to Canadians, the document says, to define their brand, the image we want people to visualize when they think about Canada. We want the world to see beyond moose and mounties and think of Canada's dynamism. Okay, you've both been around the world quite a bit. Michael, to you first. As it stands right now, does the world have a problem seeing us as anything but a nice country with moose and mounties?
Well, I take a slightly more positive view of that. I think we are seen as a leader in many senses, and we may not think of ourselves that way, but from my experience in the Middle East, in terms of technology as a desirable partner, in terms of new thinking and what have you. Now, I agree with much of what's in Ed's report, and that all of these things need to be improved, can be improved. It's a very competitive world out there. And to be successful, we need more focus, not less. At the same time, what I wonder about from looking at the report is our ability to focus the agenda as Ed wants us to. In other words, there are so many disparate elements, and I think that's reflected in the report, pulling at internally pulling at the Canadian government, special interest groups, ethnic groups, et cetera, et cetera. And
makes it difficult
they all
to focus.
have different interests. They're all pulling us in different directions. So I don't think, in many respects, there can be that kind of consensus unless we're dealing with economic matters, very important, technology matters, very important. But on the great political issues, I think governments tend to allow themselves to be pushed and pulled. And often it results in no action. Great words, but when the rubber hits the road, there's nothing.
Okay, Akaash, give us your view.
I think that there's a great dissociation in the world's mind between the nation and the state of Canada. And that is to say, I don't think there's a single multilateral or international institution that isn't riddled with Canadians. There are Canadians in every international institution.
I assume you mean this is a good thing.
Very much so,
okay.
Except that they'll all tell you why the Leafs will never win the Stanley Cup. However, at the same time as Canadians are playing as individuals an increasingly prominent role on the world stage, I think there's been a precipitous decline in the role, the authority, and the standing of the Canadian government in the corridors of power. In part, I think this is a natural consequence of the fact that governments in general have declined in power as economies have become globalized and as the nature of technology has elevated individuals and corporations. But I think it's also in part that the Canadian government has lost a certain focus. In some ways, it's a good thing because we have been stripped of our reassuring self-illusion that we are the world's peacekeepers, the world's honest broker. We now live in a world that is profoundly disintermediated, and international capitalists don't need an intermediary to carry messages on their behalf.
Can I just understand whether you are referring to this government of Canada or just the government of Canada, regardless of who's in office?
I would have to say the government of Canada.
It's a generic statement you're
making.
Very
much so. I think it has accelerated under the current government, but I think it's an acceleration of an existing trend. We now feel that the world needs more of Canada, but it is individual Canadians rather than the government of Canada who seem to be carrying that message to the world.
Okay, let me get Ed to comment on these things. First of all, to Michael's point that the kind of consensus you are looking to achieve probably can't happen in this country right now. What do you say to that?
This is a tough country to govern. You know, I can't remember how many cheeses that Charles de Gaulle said that France had. I think it was 142 or something. How can you govern a country with 142 cheeses? But we've got more people from around the world, diversity and ethnicities, than France has cheeses. And we have provinces and provincial and regional economies and many things. That doesn't make it impossible. We've seen that it's possible at various times. It makes it more difficult, and particularly in the world in which there is much more diplomatic competition and global competition. You know, after, you know, in the great era of Pearson diplomacy, well, you know, Europe was flat on its back after the Second World War. India was coming out of colonialism. China was in a revolution. It was a different world. But I think if we pick our spots, and if we could be consistent in those spots and apply ourselves consistently, we can make a difference. I think we've made a difference in Afghanistan. I think we have a great military machine now that we've built up that might go in other failing states and might be of use there. So I think there are many places where, you know, where we can govern. We just got to get over particularly the reluctance we have to have mature, difficult conversations domestically before we take our issues abroad.
Michael Bell, what about that? Pick our spots and we can be effective and speak with one voice.
I think we can, but there's a great reluctance on the part of governments to pick a spot and stick with it. My experience has been that very often governments, I'm speaking about the security, strategic, and a batch of large political and security issues, to say things without any intention of following through. I remember Lloyd Axworthy, when I was in Egypt, came there and they talked about demining in Egypt. And the Egyptians got maps out and what have you. Lloyd Axworthy, on the way out, I said to one of the guys that was responsible for the demining aspect that was on his delegation, well, how are we got to follow up on this? He said, don't bother. We're not going to do it.
Who said don't bother?
One of his staff.
One of Axworthy's, this is the
Yeah.
former Liberal Foreign Affairs
Yeah.
Minister.
He said, we're not going to do it. We don't want to do it. So I think what that argues for is very clear national agenda that becomes enculturated. In other words, it's not here today and gone next month when something sexier or some crisis overtakes us, but that we see through consistently over a period of years, and I think there we can make a real difference. And in foreign policy terms, that's what people remember.
Add a follow-up?
And I just want to, you know, I agree completely around the consistency and applying yourself, but you got to be serious about what you say in the world. If you're going to say something, believe it. So, you know, we said Kyoto targets. We never believed it. We weren't serious about it. We've now set new targets. Just, you know, just this past January, Minister Prentice set new targets. There's no action underneath those targets again. So, you know, if you want to be taken seriously, you got to treat yourself seriously. You got to behave seriously. I don't think it's an impossible thing to do.
The Walrus is a really good Canadian magazine, won a lot of awards recently, and here's probably one of the reasons why. Jennifer Welsh, writing from Oxford University in The Walrus. Aside from maintaining a heavy Canadian presence in Afghanistan and asserting our territorial integrity in the Arctic, the government's foreign policy initiatives have been quite literally all over the map, championing a free trade agreement with Colombia while imposing new visa restrictions on nationals from our NAFTA partner Mexico, promoting a new relationship with India while holding off on a prime ministerial visit to China for 4 years, shifting foreign aid from Africa to Latin America and the Caribbean, and leading the world on Israeli-Palestinian relations by refusing to attend the 2009 World Conference Against Racism, as temporarily halting funding to the Palestinian Authority in 2006, and stepping up Canada's commitment to defend Israel against attack. Akaash, does this speak to what you were just referring to a moment ago? What we haven't done a good job, regardless of who's in power, of kind of clearly identifying what we stand for, what our priorities ought to be?
I think it does. I think it also reflects the fact that many of the convulsions of foreign policy have less to do with political attention deficit disorder and more to do with the fact that we increasingly use foreign policy debates not as a way of identifying and defining what it is, where our interests lie internationally and what we wish to achieve on the global stage, but instead as a proxy battle for domestic issues in an attempt to appeal to domestic constituencies and to win Ottawa's version of a high school debating contest. Ultimately, these end up being words without meaning, and even when the government gets this debate right, high words cast a long shadow over low deeds, and a failure to follow up on the right decision merely throws into relief how frequently we make the wrong decisions.
We just put a quote up on the screen there. Can't recall if it was a tweet or an email, but basically there's an international relations student saying, there it is right here, oh, via live chat. Okay, thank you. I attended an international master's program. Canada has precisely the reputation we think we have. Nice, helpful, unexciting. Does that go, I mean, would you be content with that if that's how the world saw us?
Well, I'm not content with it. However, I think that's the risk we run, because we don't have to be all things to all people, but we have to have a sense of national interest. We have to be determined to follow those key strands and to do so consistently. In other words, not today and then move off to something else tomorrow, but to be selective. Be selective in what we do. Be selective where we give aid. Be clear as to why we're doing it.
Well, let me follow up with that on that. You know, if you're in Haiti and you just had a horrible, tragic earthquake, you know, having a neighbor who's nice and helpful is not a bad thing.
No,
Maybe
look,
it's good to be nice and helpful.
Nice and helpful is much better than the third, what was that, uninteresting?
Unexciting.
Unexciting, right. So nice and helpful is good. Purposeful and self-interested isn't bad either. And you know, there's no contradiction between doing good and doing well. So, you know, there's not just not a contradiction, but if you actually want to do good in the world, first you have to do well. You have to be prosperous in order to do well. Norway is a good example of that. It's a country that has leveraged its oil wealth, essentially, and become a diplomatic player. It plays heavily in development politics. It plays heavily in Sri Lanka. It's a very important player in the Middle East. It's really kind of taken the role that Canada had. Those were the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s, as we'll recall. You know, that's a role that Canada can play in places, but you got to be focused. You can't be all over the world. So take just for a moment, we talk about Latin America a lot. We talk about this, you know, hemisphere. Well, what do we do in it? We're in Haiti, and that's good, and there's domestic politics involved there too. Guatemala is a country that's heading in the wrong direction. It might need help at some point. That's the kind of place where I think Canada can be very useful with the skills that we have, and be useful with our ally, the United States, where our interests are common.
Let me try this with Michael. Michael, you said a second ago you want us to be more focused, and you know, rather than being all things to all people, pick something we can be good at and make an impact. Okay, the Harper government has used this G20 summit to champion maternal health internationally. Does this, in your view, do what you want? We've picked something we want to be good at and have an influence at? Here we go.
It can, and it could. Whether it will or not is another question, because I think, although it's quite controversial, obviously, the whole question of abortion, family planning, is left off the Canadian agenda, and it won't be left off the agenda of anyone else that I can see participating. So if you're missing a key element, your effectiveness, not only in terms of programs and projects that you might undertake, but your effectiveness as a leader, it seems to me, your credibility, your legitimacy is undercut. And I know that other governments, money is fluid, it's fungible. So what's going to happen is we won't touch abortion, others will make it up for us. But if we want a leading role in these things, we have to assert ourselves across the spectrum. And it's not just a question, for instance, switching back to Haiti, of going in there and doing the good thing. But is there a governance role there? Should we be sticking it out? Should we be an agent in a special relationship with Haiti? We have to decide that. We shouldn't just go in there, give the aid for 6 months, talk about it a lot, and gradually it gets chopped away. And that way, internationally, with the Americans, with Europeans, with others, you gain credibility because you have the expertise. They don't necessarily have it.
Let me preface, I know you want to get in on this and I'm going to let you, but let me preface your remarks by saying you are admittedly the former National Policy Chair of the Liberal Party of Canada.
And proudly.
And proudly, but I want that on the record so when people hear what you're about to say about whether or not the Harper Conservatives have undercut the family planning internationally message by the brouhaha over abortion, they can take that into account when you make your comments. Go, Akaash.
Having said that,
yes.
I think that the issue of maternal care, that being our focus for the G8 and the G20, that is a classic demonstration of both insincerity, gullibility, and conflict avoidance. I think the reason why maternal care was chosen initially as the centerpiece for the G20 is because it is quite literally a motherhood issue. It was chosen by the government because they thought it would be non-controversial. Who can argue with it? It allows us to make speeches, to pontificate, and to hopefully bask in the reflected glory of the people. However, once the issue of abortion came to the fore, the entire agenda around maternal care was hijacked by domestic political debate, which in all reality had very little to do with maternal care or even abortion internationally. It became a proxy battle between Canadians who are pro-life and Canadians who are pro-choice, and it became a symbol of whether or not how this government felt about abortion in Canada. And in the final analysis, amongst all this sound and fury, the government and the G20 have yet to publish anything that says what exactly this maternal health agenda means. There's no agenda, there's no suggestion of funding in the Canadian government's proposal. At the end of the day, it will become an issue that will allow people to stand up, to make speeches, and it will be forgotten the day after.
Well, you know, Steve, I think the problem here is like buried right in your question. The Harper government has done this. And there's nothing wrong with the Harper government doing it, but we need continuity. If we're serious about maternal and child health, we need a consensus in the country that those particular Millennium Development Goals, which have been around for a number of years now, they're Millennium Development Goals, it's now 2010, are things that Canada is committed to. Us, we seem to be committed to HIV, AIDS, several summits ago. Us, we were committed to the NEPAD in the Kananaskis Summit some years ago. What you don't want this to turn into is a series of deliverables that are tied to a summit. You want this to be a serious commitment by the government of Canada that continues when governments change as well.
And is that what this was?
Well, you know, you'll only know that 5 or 10 years from now, but obviously, you know, as Akaash says, the consensus isn't there around this. It was kind of just sprung on people, and it became controversial in its own way. So I would think that it's a deliverable for a particular summit, and not a continuing commitment of Canada and the Canadian people.
And for all governments of any political stripe, and indeed in any democracy, the government can only lead where the people will follow. The key towards having a foreign policy that becomes the signature policy not just for a particular government, but for the country, is engaging the population in a national debate. And governments of all stripes have been averse to doing that because it calls upon the people to make hard choices. The last time I think that we did this was around Afghanistan, and that even then it was a comparatively easy, not an easy, but comparatively an easy choice, because we felt under threat. We deployed troops, which I think was the right thing to do, and we put our people in harm's way. But the moment Canadians started coming home in body bags, the moment Canadians realized that fighting a war has as much to do about shooting the enemy as protecting the innocent, suddenly politicians of all stripes lost heart. They muddied the debate, they pretended Afghanistan was about something other than what it is, and Canadians quite naturally lost faith and lost heart in a war that was costing us a great deal and returning value that no politician was willing to speak to.
Michael?
Yeah, I think the Afghanistan case is very instructive. You know, it's a policy that in my view is doomed to failure and was doomed from the very beginning to failure. And the reason, as I understand it, why we first got involved was the Americans were pushing us to get involved in Iraq. And Jean Chrétien said, how can we tell them that we don't have troops for Iraq? It was to get into Afghanistan. And then that grew. We didn't get involved in one hopeless case, but we went into another hopeless case, and all the evidence is that it won't work. Now, it's not that I'm against a continuing presence for training and what have you, because in foreign policy, we're also concerned with NATO, we're concerned with our relations with the Americans, but let's not kid ourselves. Cold hard analysis says that the odds are that this isn't going to work, so why we're doing it is to serve our broder national interests.
Okay, we don't want to get derailed into a debate about Afghanistan here, but okay,
I'm
make
just
one more comment.
because we have something we can disagree about here, which is good. I think, you know, I would just look at it in a little bit differently, not about Afghanistan per se, as you don't want to, but it's produced a couple things. I think it produces, first of all, that Canada and Canadians have actually shown more fortitude than I think many of their leaders would have given them credit for. There have been, you know, a large loss of life and a tragic loss of life, but Canadians haven't really lost heart because of that. They've accepted that there's sacrifices, and they've rallied around our soldiers in a magnificent way.
There have not been demonstrations in the streets against the war in Afghanistan. Right?
There is a muddled strategy, but I'm just there, yeah. And there was. I just want to make the point. There was an all-party consensus
very much so.
Around this and around when we would come out, and it shows that the political system can work to come up with a consensus when the stakes are high enough.
I do have to take issue with one statement here, which I think demonstrates how muddled the national debate has become. The argument that we sent committed troops to Afghanistan to resist George Bush's call to go into Iraq is an argument that has great currency. It's also completely absurd. We went into Afghanistan 2 years before the Americans invaded Iraq. 2 years. We committed troops 2 years before the Americans had any troops in Iraq. The idea that we committed troops to Afghanistan 2 years before Iraq as an excuse not to go into Iraq suggests that Jean Chrétien had a time machine.
The drums were beating, though, for 2 years.
No, I'm sorry I have to take issue with that. There was a cabinet discussion. I've talked to cabinet ministers who've been at this meeting who told me that Chrétien said, where can we perhaps increase our involvement so we can say we don't have to go to Iraq?
2 years before the Iraq
No.
Well, we sort of went to Afghanistan twice.
Reconfigured. We went twice,
did.
and I'm talking about the second time.
We did, and again, there was a national consensus there. There was an all-party vote in favor of being prepared to go into Afghanistan. And I think really that was the high watermark of national debate and national consensus.
Hang on. No, we could spend all the rest of the time.
I just want one last
Michael, you're killing me here. Go ahead.
Yeah. There's a reality of what happens behind the scenes that politicians and others don't talk about.
Sure.
Then there's the public debate, consensus, et cetera, which are words that are aims that are desirable. But I can tell you that in the rooms with the closed doors, things don't operate like that.
That's what they were saying. Okay, let's move. We're going to try and cover some of the other items in Ed's report as well, the GPS product. Thanks, Michael. We're at chapter 3 now, right, Michael? Bottom of page 3 here. If we want to be known as an energy superpower, better yet, a clean energy superpower, or the most diverse and welcoming land in the world, or an international peacemaker and problem solver, or an Arctic power, or the innovation nation, we need to work hard at being those things. Ed, to you first. Is it realistic to try to be all of those things, or do you have to pick?
Well, I think there was an or in the sentence, and although I do think it's realistic to be more than one thing, but you want to have a brand out there that has a coherent message. So you don't want your brand to be, 5 or 6 different things. The branding we talked about was Open Canada, open to ideas, open to newcomers, open to investment, the most open country in the world, and a country in which knowledge is great currency, innovation is great currency. We want to be that knowledge innovation country. That's a magnet for human talent to come to Canada. The combination of our fiscal prudence and our pluralism is a pretty powerful argument in favor of Canada. If we invest a little bit more heavily as well in innovation, I think that
Which
then
we don't.
we could. Well, we're below the OECD average, and we recommend moving that to 3% of GDP, which would put us up in the kind of top tier of countries in that sphere. And then I think we'll have the powerful knowledge nation we want to be.
Ed talks about creating a brand for Canada beyond, obviously, moose and clubbing baby seals and, what else, the tar sands and this kind of thing. So if there's one thing we want to be known for in the world, Akaash, what do you think it is?
I think that our greatest asset as a country, especially at this juncture in history, is the fact that we are a pluralistic society. I think that at a time when the world is locked in a jealous embrace with self-destruction, ours is a society that works tremendously well. And I think that the founders of Canada were smarter than they knew. It is extraordinary that during the 19th century, at a time when the nation-state was in the ascendant, they chose to create a country that was based upon a political rather than an ethnic or linguistic ideal, on the idea that it's possible to have a new kind of state where people are stronger together, not in spite of their differences, but precisely because of their differences.
If Richard Wynne were here, he would say it's because it was neither an Englishman or a Frenchman who created this country. It was a Scot.
He might be quite right.
John A. Macdonald.
But today, I think it has led into the reality that the new emerging economic hyperpowers are, of course, China and India. And our second and third largest ethnic groups are Chinese Canadians and Indian Canadians. And that fact positions us better than any other country on the planet for the new coming economic order.
I don't mean to dismiss that and don't infer that from my question, but we do hear that a lot, that because we have so many different people from so many different parts of the world here, that positions us nicely to ... fill in the blanks. Is that really true?
I think it has its limits. I think it certainly can be a tremendous advantage, and I think we are using it, and as Ed said, we can use it more effectively. On the other hand, as a, let's say, technology leader, as a trading and investment partner and what have you, that may establish links with the Chinese and with the Indians. But people will come to us if we're in the lead, if we're assertive and we're effective. you ask about what our top priority should be. I would say, or priority, I would say there should be a number. The Arctic can be a priority. And you know why? I think because it touches us directly. We're an Arctic power. So automatically, we have credibility and legitimacy that others wouldn't.
We don't think of ourselves that way. None
No.
of us, I mean,
No, but
what, 90% of us live within 2 hours of the U.S. border, not in the Arctic. We
Right.
don't think of ourselves as an Arctic
But
power.
it's up to governments, I think, to make policies that serve our interests, and we do have interests up there, obviously, and to convince Canadians by not any means, but by all legitimate means, that this is in their interest. Because if we talk about credibility in Washington or London or Paris or Beijing, those decisions are made on their view of us, not only in a specific area, but how serious we are. When we get involved, do we see it through? Do we take tough decisions? Do we support certain failed states?
You want to follow up, Ed?
Yeah, you know, I think we have 5 or 6 great assets out in the world. Diversity is one of them. Our resources, one of them. Our knowledge base is a great asset. Our proximity to the states, our Pacific status. But the Arctic is definitely one of those assets as well. And what's different is we've always had a kind of romanticism around the North that led us to go, you know, wow, let's be a northern nation. Roads to the north under Diefenbaker and all this. But then when the bill came in, we didn't want to pay the bill. So, you know, we've announced, you know, this and that. We've had icebreakers, nuclear submarines, everything. We've never actually delivered. There's difference because of global warming. The Arctic is going to be accessible in an economic way. There is going to be shipping through the Arctic. That region now is in a geopolitical play. They care about it and they talk about it in London. They care about it and talk about it in Beijing, in Korea, in the United States. Everywhere, this is on the map, and we are a power there.
Keep this up, Michael. Leave this up here. Not Michael Bell, Michael Smith, our director. How can Canada have a brand when I, as a Canadian, don't even know what we're about? Now, we have this, you know, constant effort to try to define what our identity is, and we're trying to sell ourselves as something to the world. And I think this person who's participating in the live chat has articulated a common problem that we've been dealing with for a very long time. What would you say to that?
Throughout all of our history, we've been in love with our own anguish over who and what it is that we are. And I almost hesitate to say this, but I think to a certain extent that is part of who we are. This constant questioning and this constant dynamism about our identity. The fact that we as a people do change, and the fact that our identity isn't rooted in a single language, a single part of geography, a single historical fact. But I actually think that means that what does define us is not what we've inherited, but what we choose to be. I think it is our values as a country, and I've already stated, I think that pluralism is the strongest of it, is what gives us our identity on the world stage. That is one of the reasons I think that we're perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being a nice and generally harmless people. And that's not a bad thing. It gives us entree. But the question then becomes, what do you do with it? And you can't be afraid to sacrifice it. What I mean by that is that the truth rarely lies midway between two extremes. And as a country, we often have been so reluctant to give up our status as the nice neighbor next door that we have shied away from difficult decisions.
Okay. Michael Smith, we're running tight on time, so I'm going to ditch the Globe and Mail board, and I just want to go right to Ed with this question here. One of the parts of our brand, I guess, that we have been able to take out and strut around for the rest of the world because of how well our banks did during the economic crisis we've been through, is the brand of being good financial managers. Our finance minister's been doing a lot of traveling lately, trying to make sure that the rest of the G20 don't bring in this bank tax that he says we don't need because our banks are very, very good, thanks very much. But how do we show the world that we're fiscal leaders when looks like a lot of other countries that are a lot bigger than us are going to put this tax in after all? Thanks, Canada, for your advice, but we're not paying attention.
Well, whether we win the argument along with a lot of other countries that don't want this bank tax, or whether we lose that argument, I mean, first of all, we remain sovereign and we'll have a bank tax or not have a bank tax ourselves. Everyone has an interest in everybody else's sovereignty now, because what happens in Greece impacts what happens here in Toronto to people. But nonetheless, you have your own decisions. I think what's important in there is that Canada's fiscal standing and its regulation of its banks give us a message that gives us credibility out in the world to talk about something. It's kind of like a mini Suez moment. I don't want to overstate it, but it is one of those moments where the world can look to us for some leadership and some ideas and emulation, as they will around diversity. And I think we've got to take those moments and say, okay, how do we build our influence off that? How do we build our credibility? How do we make sure the G20 and the G8 are not the end of the sentence? Gone, let's talk about another 8-20 years, although there'll never be another G8 in Canada. Rather, how do we make that the beginning of a discussion where Canada maintains this conversation leadership?
Okay, we got about 3 minutes left here, and I'm sure he's not watching, but there's a chance that some of his minions might be. So give some advice to Stephen Harper on the eve of the G20. He's got a couple of days where he's going to be king of the world. What should he be doing?
Well, I think he's decided what he's going to do, but if I were him, what I would have tried to do is focus on, as Ed Study does, on 3 or 4 key areas, and to assert a leadership role, but a leadership role that has value added. That's not just to get us through this summit, as I suspect may be the case, and then it's somebody else's problem, but to thoughtfully reflect on where we can be most effective and be tough about it, but we have to be tough, you have to be credible to any good purpose. I don't think that's the case. I think there's a lot of planning, and I'm not just talking about the Conservative government, the present government, but it may be, I would say, a little more the case here than it has been in the past. These decisions are taken in the Prime Minister's office on the spur of the moment, rather than a matter of research,
Gotcha.
Reflection, and what have you.
Akaash.
I think that to make this G20 summit successful, he has to view it not as an end in itself, but as part of a larger narrative. His predecessors, men like Wilfrid Laurier, made Canada a true partnership between Anglophones and Francophones. The world is a better place for it. Lester Pearson created international peacekeeping, and the world is a better place for it. When the time comes, the eyes of future generations will be upon him, and they will ask him, for all the wealth that we had during a time of poverty, for all the power that you had during a time of uncertainty, for all the stability that we have during a time of instability, what did you do to make the world a better place? And that does not begin and end at the G20. It means the G20 has to be part of a complex puzzle.
Does he have an answer for that yet, Stephen Harper?
You know, I think Mr. Harper has part of an answer, certainly, to that. I mean, Canada has authority right now in the question that most animates the countries of the world who will be at the G20, and that's their economic recovery or their slide into less and less prosperity. And I think Canada speaks with great authority there. And I think, you know, part of Mr. Harper's main job as the chair of this meeting is to make sure that there's a coherent message to markets and to citizens of the world that our economy is being well managed and will move forward. That's the first thing you do. The second thing he can do is this. The G20 needs some kind of coherent structures itself if it's going to move forward. It's not ready to have a secretariat yet, but I think Mr. Harper should say, we're giving you a present of a de facto secretariat. We're setting it up here, and it will be a think tank for all the G20 countries, and we're going to hire people from all the G20 countries in this, and that's our gift as the host of this G20. And I think eventually it would evolve into that secretariat.
Gotcha. I want to thank all three of you for coming in tonight and helping us out on the eve of the G20 summit here in Toronto. Akaash Maharaj, the New Liberalism Foundation. Michael Bell, the former ambassador, served us ably overseas for a very long time. University of Windsor, good to have both of you here. Edward Greenspon, Open Canada, that is his report, the GPS. And we thank all three of you once again for being here tonight on TVO.